The mysterious distress call. The vastness of space was silent, endless, and dark. It had no mercy, no emotion. Just a cold, infinite void stretching forever. But in the silence, a signal echoed. Weak, old, desperate. Admiral Jonathan Kane stood on the bridge of TNS Revenant, the flagship of Earth's most powerful fleet. He was a man who had seen war, had made impossible decisions, and had survived battles that should have killed him. But this was different. This was unknown. "Are you sure this isn't a mistake?" Kane asked, his deep voice cutting through the hum of the command deck. Lieutenant Vega, the communications officer, nodded. "It's real, sir. It came through one of our deep space relays. The signal is old, but it's still transmitting." Kane narrowed his eyes at the holoscreen in front of him. The signal had been picked up 6 hours ago, coming from an uncharted region near the galactic rim. No known colonies, no recorded civilizations, just empty space. The message was garbled, fragmented by time and interference. But a few words were unmistakable. "Help us. They are coming." Silence filled the bridge. Nova, the fleet's AI, spoke through the ship's systems, her voice calm and precise. "Signal age is estimated to be over 10,000 years old. The distress beacon is still active, meaning someone or something is keeping it powered." Kane leaned back in his chair, thinking. A 10,000-year-old signal. That was impossible. Even the oldest known alien civilizations barely recorded histories that far back. And yet, this message existed. Could be a ghost signal, Commander Harlow suggested. An old distress call bouncing through subspace, repeating endlessly. Or it could be a trap, another officer muttered. Kane tapped his fingers on the metal armrest of his chair. A distress call from before human civilization even existed. That wasn't something you ignored. "Prepare the fleet," he ordered. "Set course for the signal's origin." A low hum filled the bridge as the fleet's warp drives powered up. The Lithal Fleet, as it was called by the galaxy, was not built for diplomacy. It was built for war. And if this was a trap, they would be ready. The journey into the unknown. The fleet moved through hyperspace like a predator hunting in the dark. 50 warships, each armed with weapons that could shatter moons. The Terran Dominion did not send explorers into the unknown. They sent conquerors. As the minutes passed, tension grew. Even the most battle-hardened officers felt uneasy. Something about this mission felt wrong. Kane stood near the observation deck, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace outside. Commander Harlow approached him. "You have a bad feeling about this," Harlow said. It wasn't a question. Kane exhaled slowly. "Everything about this feels off. We've answered distress calls before," Harlow pointed out. Kane turned to look at his second-in-command, not ones that predate humanity itself. Arrival at the dead world. The moment they dropped out of hyperspace, alarms blared across the fleet. The planet ahead was shattered, its surface covered in scars of war. "What the hell happened here?" Vega whispered. On the holoscreen, images of the planet's cracked surface and dead cities appeared. There were no signs of life, no transmissions, only the weak, constant ping of the distress signal coming from deep underground. Nova processed the data and spoke. This planet was not destroyed by natural causes. It was wiped out by a war, one that left nothing alive. Kane's stomach tightened. The last time humanity had seen destruction like this was during the extinction wars, when the Dominion had turned entire planets into graveyards. "What's the source of the signal?" Kane asked. "Buried beneath the surface," Nova answered, "approximately 5 kilometers below ground. The signal's power source is still operational." Kane clenched his jaw. That means someone, or something, kept it running. A heavy silence filled the bridge. Harlow crossed his arms. "I don't like this." Kane gave a single nod. Neither did he, but there was no turning back now. "Send a recon team," he ordered. "I want boots on the ground in the next 5 minutes." The fleet did not know what awaited them beneath the planet's surface. But soon they would. And it would change everything. The dead world. The recon ship Raptor 9 descended through the planet's broken atmosphere, moving carefully between massive, floating debris fields. The sky was dark, thick with dust and radiation clouds that blocked the distant sun. The world below was dead, lifeless, cold, and silent. Admiral Kane watched from the TNS Revenant, his eyes fixed on the mission feed coming from the recon team's helmets. They had landed near the distress signal's location, a gigantic ruined city, its towers broken, streets cracked and filled with eerie silence. "This place is a graveyard," Lieutenant Connor muttered as he stepped onto the surface, his armored boots crunching against brittle stone. Captain Reynolds, the recon leader, motioned for his team to spread out. "Stay sharp. If something's still here after 10,000 years, we don't want to meet it unprepared." The soldiers activated their scanners, sweeping the area for movement. Their breathing was the only sound in the stillness. No wind, no wildlife, no signs of life at all. Then suddenly, BEEP, a proximity alert flared in Reynolds' visor. The distress beacon was still active, directly below them. "We've got a structure underground," Reynolds said. He knelt and brushed away dust, revealing an alien script carved into the ground. "What does it say?" Vega's voice came through from the fleet. Reynolds' translator took a few seconds before displaying the results. "To those who find this, run." The recon team exchanged uneasy glances. "Admiral, do you see this?" Reynolds asked. Kane's voice was calm but firm. "Proceed. Carefully." Using plasma cutters, the team breached the ground, revealing a tunnel entrance. A metallic hatch, covered in claw marks, led into darkness. "I go like this," Connor whispered. Reynolds inhaled sharply. "We move in." One by one, the team descended into the abyss. The descent into darkness. Inside the tunnel, walls were lined with alien engravings, scenes of war, destruction, and something worse. Massive figures, twisted and monstrous, devouring entire cities. "This was no ordinary war," Reynolds murmured. As they moved deeper, their helmet lights flickered. A static hiss filled their radios. Then something clicked in the distance. The team froze. A mechanical noise. Slow, deliberate. "Did you hear that?" One soldier whispered. The clicking sound grew louder, closer. Reynolds signaled for silence. His heart pounded. Something was moving in the dark. Then, in the distance, their helmet lights caught something impossible. A body. Not human. Not fully alien. A fusion of flesh and machine, its limbs twisted, its body partially consumed by metallic growths. "It's still warm," Connor muttered, touching the corpse. Before anyone could react, the walls around them shuddered. The clicking sound multiplied. Reynolds looked up, his breath catching in his throat. Eyes. Dozens of them. Above them, something clung to the ceiling, its long metallic claws scraping against the walls. Then, it dropped. First contact with the unknown. The creature landed in the middle of the team with a bone-rattling thud. Its body was inhuman, its torso elongated, its limbs unnaturally jointed. Its head had no face, only a gaping metal maw with rows of shifting, grinding teeth. Then it screamed, a horrible, high-pitched wail, like metal tearing apart. "Open fire," Reynolds roared. The team unleashed hell, their rifles blazing, filling the corridor with flashing light. Bullets tore into the creature, sparking against the metallic growths on its body. But it didn't die. It moved. Fast. Too fast. It lashed out, its claws slicing through armor like paper. Connor screamed as he was lifted into the air, his body torn in half in an instant. Reynolds fired at its head. A direct hit, but it kept coming. "Fall back. Fall back." The team retreated, dragging their wounded, but the walls began to shift. More eyes opened. Hundreds of them. The tunnel was alive. "Command, we need immediate evac," Reynolds shouted, his voice barely audible over the sounds of tearing flesh and gunfire. But the creatures were not letting them leave. A trap 10,000 years in the making. On the TNS Revenant, alarms blared. Nova, the AI, spoke with urgency. Multiple heat signatures detected beneath the surface. Something is awakening. Kane clenched his fists. He had seen battle. He had seen horrors of war. But this was different. Pull them out. Now. The fleet's dropships rushed down, deploying combat mechs and heavy firepower. The moment they reached the surface, something erupted from the ground. A towering creature, over 50 feet tall, part machine, part organic horror. "God damn it," Kane muttered. "What the hell are these things?" Then the distress signal changed. A new message played through their comms, spoken in an ancient, broken voice. "You should not have come." The warning that came too late. From orbit, the fleet detected movement across the planet. Beneath the dead cities, inside the ruins, thousands of the creatures were waking up. This was not a distress call. It was a warning, and they had arrived too late. The horror awakens. The ground beneath the recon team trembled violently. Dust and debris rained down from the tunnel ceiling as the monstrous creatures crawled from the walls, their metallic claws clicking against stone. Captain Reynolds barely had time to reload before one of the creatures lunged at him, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally fast. He barely dodged, rolling to the side as the thing slammed into the wall, cracking the stone like fragile glass. "Command, we need EVAC now," Reynolds shouted, his voice raw with urgency. Above them, on the TNS Revenant, alarms blared. Admiral Kane watched the recon team's live feed with a clenched jaw. "Deploy exfil teams," he barked. "Get them out of there. Now." The fleet's dropships blasted through the planet's thick atmosphere, deploying combat drones and heavy troopers armed with plasma cannons. The mission was no longer reconnaissance. It was extraction under fire. Trapped in the underground hell, back in the tunnels, Reynolds and his surviving men ran for their lives. The creatures were not just attacking. They were hurting the humans deeper underground. "This isn't a random attack." Vega's voice came through their earpieces from orbit. "They're forcing you into a choke point." Reynolds cursed under his breath. He could see it now, twisting corridors, leading them down instead of out. The creatures were intelligent. They weren't just killing. They were hunting. Connor's voice crackled in panic. "THEY coming from the ceiling." One of the beasts dropped onto him, its claws tearing through his armor like it was paper. His screams echoed through the comms before cutting off abruptly. "Damn it." Reynolds turned and fired, his rifle overheating, as he emptied his entire magazine into the creature. It shrieked, metallic flesh, melting as the plasma rounds burned through it. But behind it, more eyes glowed in the dark. There was no time to mourn, no time to breathe. Just run. The chamber of the lost. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a massive underground chamber, larger than any city on Earth. The recon team skidded to a stop, their lights shining over a sight beyond nightmares. Rows upon rows of pods. Suspended from the walls and ceiling, thousands of alien figures were trapped inside the glass-like containment chambers. Some were humanoid, others beast-like, all frozen in place with expressions of terror. "What the hell is this?" Reynolds breathed. Nova, the AI, processed the scene from orbit, analyzing. These beings were not prisoners. They were food. Before Reynolds could react, the pods began to open. A sickening hiss filled the air. Thick, black tendrils emerged from the pods, dripping with a metallic fluid. Then, the screams began. The creatures inside the pods were alive, but as they woke up, their bodies contorted in pain. Their flesh twisted, bones cracked, and metal fused with their bodies, transforming them into more of the horrors the team had been running from. "Oh God," a soldier whispered. "We need to get out of here," Reynolds shouted. But the creatures were already moving. The evacuation begins. Above ground, the dropships arrive, releasing shock troopers in exosuits. The first platoon landed outside the collapsed city ruins, their weapons scanning the perimeter. "This place is a damn tomb," one trooper muttered. Then, the ground exploded. The creatures burst from the dirt, leaping onto the troopers with terrifying speed. Weapons blazed, plasma shots melting through their bodies, but some kept coming, even after being cut in half. "Fall back! Fall back!" One of the pilots inside the dropship turned to his co-pilot. "Do you hear that?" The co-pilot's face was pale. "That's not static." Then, through the radio, a new voice spoke, a voice that had not been heard in 10,000 years. "You have awakened us. Now you will feed us." The fleet's systems glitched, power flickered, ship lights dimmed, and the AI Nova shut down momentarily. Admiral Kane felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just an old enemy. This was a hive intelligence, and it had just woken up. The hive's rise. Back in the tunnels, Reynolds' team fought desperately toward the extraction point, but the newly transformed creatures were everywhere. A soldier screamed as a tendril wrapped around his throat, pulling him into the darkness. His rifle clattered to the floor, firing wildly as his muffled cries faded. Reynolds fired a flare, illuminating the hundreds of creatures crawling from the chamber walls, their bodies still forming, but already hostile. "Command, where the hell is our RID?" Above, Kane made a decision. "We're not leaving them," he growled. "But we're burning that place to the ground." "Sir, that might trigger a planetary collapse," a tactical officer warned. Kane's eyes darkened. "Better the planet dies than humanity." "Understood." He turned to Nova, now back online. "Prepare the Thanatos cannon." A hush fell over the bridge. Nova processed his command. "The Thanatos cannon is a doomsday weapon, Admiral. Once fired, planetary conditions will become uninhabitable within minutes." Kane didn't hesitate. "Then we better make sure our people are out before that happens." The final escape. The recon team finally burst through the underground exit, their armor damaged, bloodied, and burnt. They could see the dropships ahead, their turrets blazing to keep the creatures at bay. The sky was turning black. The creatures had summoned something massive from below. Reynolds didn't dare look back. "Go! Go! Movie it!" The last of the team leaped onto the dropships, the doors sealing shut just as the swarm reached them. Above, the TNS Revenant's main cannon glowed bright red, charging its devastating payload. Kane gave one final command. "Fire!" The firestorm. The Thanatos cannon unleashed a beam of unimaginable power. It tore through the planet's crust, igniting everything. The surface erupted, lava, explosions, tectonic ruptures. The fleet warped out just in time to see the world implode into itself. Silence followed. The mission was over. But Kane knew the truth. This wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning. The hive was awake, and it would come for them. The ambush. The Thanatos cannon's blast had torn through the planet's surface, splitting its tectonic plates apart. The firestorm spread as the core destabilized, triggering chain reactions across the dead world. Explosions ruptured the terrain, sending molten debris hurling into space. From orbit, the Terran Dominion's fleet watched as the planet collapsed in on itself. Dark clouds of ash swirled in the atmosphere before everything was swallowed in an earth-shattering detonation. It was over. At least, that's what they thought. The escape to orbit. The dropships carrying Reynolds and the surviving recon team rocketed into the sky, their engines straining as they escaped the chaos below. Inside, the soldiers sat in silence, wounded, exhausted, haunted. Reynolds leaned his head back, shutting his eyes. The things they had seen in those tunnels. The horrors that had awakened. This wasn't over. "Captain," a voice crackled through his comms. It was Admiral Kane. "Sitrip." Reynolds took a deep breath. "We lost 70% of the team. The ones that made it." He hesitated, glancing at his men. They weren't just injured. Some of them were changed. Their veins dark, their eyes distant, as if something inside them had been altered. "We're alive, sir, but I don't think we left that place alone." A cold silence followed. Then alarms blared. The fleet's sensors flashed red as dozens, no, hundreds, of warp signatures appeared all around them. The trap springs. Kane gripped the edge of his command chair as massive enemy warships emerged from hyperspace. Dark, angular vessels, their hulls twisted with organic growths, surrounded the Terran fleet. "Sir," Nova's voice was unnaturally sharp. "This isn't a standard formation. We're completely surrounded." Kane's heart pounded. The Veilshur, an ancient race thought to be long extinct, had returned, and they were waiting for them. A chilling voice echoed through the fleet's comms, low, guttural, inhuman. "Foolish humans, you have burned our world. Now we will consume yours." On the view screen, Overlord Zalith appeared, a towering, grotesque figure. His flesh fused with machinery, his eyes glowing with something not entirely alive. Kane stared at him. "You were already here. You let us land." Zalith's grotesque face twisted into something resembling a grin. "Yes." Reynolds, still in the dropship, gritted his teeth as he listened. It was never a distress call. It was a goddamn lure. Zalith continued, his voice cold and cruel. "Your warships are strong. Your weapons are advanced. But we do not die. We evolve. And soon, we will wear your skin as our own." The fleet's comms suddenly went dead. Then, the first shot was fired. The battle begins. The enemy fleet opened fire. A massive plasma storm erupted as the Veilshur unleashed wave after wave of energy blasts. The first Terran warships took direct hits, their shields straining under the immense pressure. "Evasive maneuvers," Kane roared. "Return fire, all weapons hot." The TNS Revenant and its sister ships counterattacked, their railguns and plasma cannons lighting up space. Missiles streamed through the void, slamming into enemy hulls and shattering their formations. But something was wrong. The Veilshur ships didn't explode like normal ships. Their organic metal bodies twisted and reshaped, absorbing damage, growing stronger with every impact. "They're adapting," Nova warned. "Every hit we land, they regenerate." Kane clenched his fists. "Then we hit harder." "Sir," one of the officers called out, his voice panicked. "They're boarding us." The Veilshur ships weren't just attacking. They were latching onto human warships, forcing breaches into the hulls. And then they poured inside. Invasion from within. On the TNS Revenant, alarms screamed as the creatures poured through gaping holes in the ship's corridors. They moved like shadows, fast and silent, their elongated limbs shifting and twisting as they skittered across the walls. Security teams fired desperately, but it was like fighting smoke. Every time they shot a creature down, its broken body reformed, becoming something even worse. Kane grabbed a rifle from a nearby weapons rack. He wasn't going to sit and watch his crew be slaughtered. "Contain them in the lower decks," he barked. "Don't let them reach the core." He stormed out, leading a squad of armored Marines through the burning corridors. As they rounded a corner, a soldier screamed, pulled into the shadows by something massive. Then it stepped into the light. A Veilshur warlord, twice the size of a man, its body fused with shifting metal and organic tendrils, its 4 glowing eyes locking onto Kane. Kane fired first. The creature vanished. And then it was behind him. The cost of war. Across the fleet, battles rage. Ships exploded. Fire tore through corridors. Men and women fought and died. Reynolds' dropship had finally made it back to the TNS Revenant, But as he and his men stepped out, they found themselves in the middle of a war zone. One of his soldiers collapsed, his body twisting as black veins spread under his skin. Reynolds took a step back, horrified. "Captain," the dying man gasped, "they got inside me." Then, his body burst apart, and something else crawled out. Reynolds opened fire, his mind screaming. The fleet was losing. Kane's last gamble. The bridge of the TNS Revenant was in chaos. Weapons officers called out damage reports. Half the fleet was either destroyed or disabled. The Veil sure were winning. Kane wiped blood from his brow, his heart hammering. This was it. His fleet was the strongest in human history, and yet they were falling. No, not today. He turned to Nova. "Prepare the Revenant Protocol." Nova hesitated. "Sir, that would mean—" "I know what it means." Kane's voice was ice. "The Revenant Protocol. A suicidal countermeasure that would overload the fleet's warp cores, creating an explosion large enough to wipe out everything in a 50-light-year radius. The Veil sure would die. But so would the entire fleet." Kane stared at the battle raging around him. He would not let these creatures reach Earth. Begin countdown. The wrath of humanity. The bridge of TNS Revenant was in chaos. The once glorious command center of Earth's most powerful warship was now a battlefield. Sparks flew from shattered consoles, alarms blared, and the acrid smell of burning metal filled the air. Admiral Jonathan Kane stood in the center, his uniform torn and stained with blood. Some of it his, some belonging to the soldiers who had fought and died around him. "Sir, the Revenant Protocol is online." Nova's voice echoed through the speakers. Kane's hands tightened into fists. The countdown had begun. 10 minutes. That's all they had before the entire fleet self-destructed, taking the Veil sure and their monstrous warships with them. But could they hold out that long? The human fleet's last stand. Outside, the battle in space had reached a breaking point. The Terran Dominion's warships fought like demons, pushing their limits against the ever-adapting Veil sure forces. Fire and debris filled the void, pieces of broken ships drifting through the battlefield like gravestones. Commander Harlow, aboard the TNS Ironclad, wiped blood from his brow as he barked orders. "Redirect all power to shields. Don't let them get inside." Aboard the TNS Warbringer, Captain Elena Vasquez watched in horror as one of her gunships was dragged into a Veil sure warship, the hull melting as it was absorbed into the enemy's biomass. "They're eating our ships," she growled. Her weapons officer cursed. "They're learning from us, Captain. Every hit we land, they adapt and counterattack." Vasquez narrowed her eyes. "Then we stop hitting. We start killing." She turned to her crew. "All batteries, fire everything we have. No mercy, no hesitation." The Warbringer's cannons ignited, unleashing a storm of kinetic and plasma fire. Entire Veil sure cruisers were blasted into unrecognizable chunks, their unnatural forms shriveling and disintegrating. Across the battlefield, humanity dug in its heels. They had minutes left to survive. The monsters on board. Inside the TNS Revenant, the situation was even worse. The Veil sure creatures had breached the ship, swarming the corridors like a plague of nightmares. Marines in heavy exosuits fought desperately, unloading everything they had into the unstoppable horrors. Keep firing. One soldier screamed, his flamethrower turning a twisted monstrosity into ash, only for its charred bones to reassemble and attack again. Reynolds, still leading his surviving recon team, fought his way to the bridge. His rifle overheated, but he didn't stop. He used it as a blunt weapon, smashing it against a Veil sure drone that lunged at him. His squad wasn't so lucky. Sergeant Mason was dragged into the shadows, his screams cut short. Private Keller tried to run, only for a black tendril to wrap around his throat and snap his neck like a twig. Reynolds and the last two survivors kicked open the bridge doors, slamming them shut behind them. Kane turned to see them, his face grim. "You're late." Reynolds panted, his body covered in alien gore. "We had problems." No one had time to laugh, because the monsters were still coming. The revelation. Nova suddenly spoke, her voice carrying an urgency that cut through the chaos. "Admiral, the Veil sure are not attacking Earth." Kane's blood ran cold. "What?" Nova's calculations flashed across the screens. "Their fleet positioning, their assault patterns, they're stalling us." Reynolds' eyes widened. "You're telling me we're not the target?" Nova's voice was grim. "They wanted us here. They needed us to activate the Revenant Protocol." Silence filled the room. Then Kane whispered, "They wanted us to destroy them." Nova's next words sent a chill through every soul on board. "Not to destroy them, Admiral, to release them." The true horror revealed. Suddenly, every veiled ship stopped attacking. The creatures froze in place, their bodies shaking, as if something unseen had awakened. Then, the voices began. A chorus of whispers filled the comms, words spoken in 1,000 forgotten tongues. Reynolds clutched his head, feeling his skull vibrate. "What the hell is that?" Nova's voice was terrified, for the first time ever. The hive consciousness, it was never alive. It was never dead. It was sealed. Kane's breath caught in his throat. It was a prison. The Veil were never conquerors. They were prison guards, and humanity had just shattered the chains. The final decision. Kane snapped out of his horror. "Are you telling me we're about to unleash something worse than the Veil?" Nova's reply was immediate. "We already have." The timer on the Revenant Protocol reached 30 seconds. The entire fleet was about to detonate, wiping out everything in the sector. But Kane's mind raced. If the Veil were a prison system, then destroying them wouldn't just kill them, it would free what they were holding back. And whatever it was something the Veil had feared enough to dedicate their entire existence to keeping locked away. Kane's fist slammed the console. "Cancel the protocol." Gasps filled the breach. "Sir, that's suicide." Harlow yelled through the comms. "We'll be overrun." Kane's voice was iron. "If we go through with this, we won't just lose this battle. We'll lose the entire galaxy." Nova hesitated. Then, the countdown stopped. The Veil warships convulsed, their monstrous bodies writhing in agony as something inside them screamed. The hive consciousness was awake. Kane grabbed the comms and shouted the only order that could save them all. "All ships, retreat." The desperate escape. The human fleet turned and ran, engines flaring as they tore into hyperspace, leaving behind the Veil and their awakening nightmare. The last image Kane saw before his ship entered warp was Overlord Zalith, watching them go. And for the first time, the ancient warlord looked afraid. The Veil had lost, but so had humanity. They had unleashed something far worse. And now it was free. The final stand. The Terran Dominion's fleet burst out of hyperspace, leaving the Veil sector behind. But the silence that followed was not relief, it was dread. On the bridge of the TNS Revenant, Admiral Jonathan Kane stood motionless, his eyes locked on the holoscreen. The battlefield they had fled was gone from view, but the terror it left behind had not vanished. The hive consciousness had awakened. And now, it was coming. The fear in the void. "Status report," Kane ordered, his voice hoarse. Nova, the ship's AI, responded immediately. "The fleet has sustained catastrophic losses. 52% of our ships are destroyed or disabled. Multiple vessels are reporting crew casualties over 80%. Kane gritted his teeth. They had barely escaped. But this was no victory. Any signs of pursuit? A long pause. Then, Nova's voice wavered. "Not yet. But Admiral, it doesn't need to chase us." Reynolds, leaning against a console, frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Nova hesitated. The entity that we have unleashed, it is not bound by the limits of conventional space. It is not a fleet. It is not a species. It is something much worse. Kane's hands curled into fists. They had escaped the battlefield, but not the consequences, because something new was waking up across the galaxy. The first signs of the apocalypse. Location: Outpost 19, near the Orion Nebula. Lieutenant Samantha Rourke sipped her stale coffee, rubbing her tired eyes. The outpost was quiet, as always. The Terran Dominion had abandoned this sector decades ago, leaving only a handful of remote listening stations to monitor deep space signals. She stared at her console, just the usual background noise of the universe: dying stars, distant pulsars, faint radio signals from long-dead civilizations. And then the signal changed. At first, it was just a whisper. Then it grew louder. A low, inhuman chorus, vibrating through her console like a heartbeat made of static. Rourke's fingers trembled. She tried to mute the transmission, but it didn't stop. The sound was inside her head. Then, the station's emergency alarms blared. ALERT. Unknown entity DETCTED. Rourke's screen glitched, flooding with symbols she didn't recognize. And then, for the first time in her life, she saw something that wasn't supposed to exist. A rift had opened outside the station, a tear in reality itself. And from it, something began to emerge. Something massive. Something alive. Rourke reached for the distress beacon. Her hand never made it. The station vanished in an instant, and with it, the first human colony fell. A war beyond understanding. On the TNS Revenant, Nova's voice turned grim. "Admiral, we just lost contact with Outpost 19. Kane exhaled slowly. No wreckage. No debris. Nothing. It is as if the station was erased. A cold, heavy silence filled the bridge. Reynolds clenched his jaw. We didn't just wake up some ancient empire, did we? Nova's response sent a chill through every soul in the room. No, we woke up something older than empires, older than stars. Harlow, still bruised and bloody from the fight, shook his head. So what the hell do we do? For a long moment, Kane didn't answer. Then he made a decision. We warn the galaxy. We call every fleet, every colony, every empire. If we stand alone, we die. But if we unite, we might have a chance. He turned to Nova. Open a system-wide distress call. Nova hesitated. Sir, if we do that, every empire in the galaxy will know we were responsible for waking it up. Kane's face was stone. I don't care. He stood tall, his voice filled with the steel of a man who had faced the abyss and survived. We end this, together, or we die alone. Nova sent the transmission, and across the galaxy, everyone heard. The Galactic Council's reaction. In the heart of the Zodphorian Empire, the High Council gathered. Alien diplomats, warlords, and emperors from 100 civilizations stared at the Terran transmission in stunned horror. This cannot be real, the Zodphorian Emperor muttered. They are lying. The Krex Dominion's war leader slammed his fist on the table. Humans are fools. They should have left the dead alone. The Rilthian scholars, an ancient race of cosmic historians, had been silent until now. Then their eldest member spoke in a shaking voice. They are not lying. The Veil sure were our enemies, yes, but they were right about one thing. All eyes turned to him. The entity they were guarding. It was not a civilization. It was the first hunger, the first predator. It does not conquer. It does not negotiate. It only consumes. The room went dead silent. The Zodphorian Emperor finally spoke. Then we must prepare for war. The final stand begins. The Terran Dominion's fleet regrouped at Station Epsilon Prime, an abandoned superstation on the galactic frontier. Hundreds of ships from dozens of civilizations arrived. Former enemies, old rivals, Warlords and diplomats who had spent centuries fighting each other, now forced to stand together against something far worse. Kane stood before them all, his voice carrying across the station's vast war room. "Make no mistake," he said. "This is not a war for territory, not a war for power." He looked around, his gaze locking onto every leader, every general. "This is a war for survival." A hologram flickered to life, showing the dead zones spreading across the galaxy. The entity wasn't waiting. It was already moving. And if they didn't stop it now, there would be nothing left to fight for. Kane drew in a breath, his next words heavy with the weight of the galaxy itself. "We hold the line here. We make our stand here. And we send that thing back to whatever hell it came from." His eyes burned with the fire of humanity's defiance. "Because if we fall, we don't just lose a battle. We lose existence itself." And with that, the last war of the galaxy began. The last war of the galaxy. The galaxy held its breath. Across thousands of star systems, empires stood united for the first time in recorded history. Civilizations that had warred for centuries. Humans, Zephorians, Krex Dominion warriors, Rilthian scholars, and countless others, now gathered under a single banner. Not for conquest, not for glory. For survival. Because what was coming was not an empire, not an army. It was the entity. And it would not stop until all life was erased. The War Council of the Galaxy. On Station Epsilon Prime, the largest war council in history convened. Admiral Jonathan Kane stood at the center, surrounded by leaders of every major faction. On the holoscreen, the galaxy itself was changing. "Every day, we lose another system," Nova reported. "Entire colonies simply vanish. No distress signals, no wreckage, just empty space where planets once were." A murmur spread through the room. "This is madness," the Zyphorian Emperor growled. "You cannot fight something you cannot see." Kane's voice was iron. "Then we learn how." He turned to Nova. "What do we know about this thing?" Nova's data projections flooded the room. "It does not move like an army. It does not use ships. It does not conquer planets. Instead, it spreads like a virus through dimensions beyond our own." She gestured to the hologram. "This means conventional weapons are limited." The Krex warlord, a battle-hardened reptilian warlord, slammed his fist on the table. "So what? We just let it consume us. That is not the Krex way." Kane shook his head. "We fight. But not like we have before." He turned to the War Council, his gaze piercing. "We need a new weapon, something built not for war as we know it, but for war against something beyond our understanding." The council fell silent. Then, an unexpected voice spoke. "We may have an answer." All eyes turned to the Rilthian scholar, the oldest being in the room. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes glowing with knowledge no living being should possess. The council waited. Finally, the old Rilthian whispered, "The Annihilation engine. The weapon to end it all." The room erupted. "The Annihilation engine is a myth," one Zyphorian scientist shouted. "No, it is real," the Rilthian scholar murmured. "A weapon so powerful, it was never meant to be used." He turned his eyes to Kane. "It was built long before our time, by a race that no longer exists." Kane's jaw tightened. "And why don't they exist anymore?" The Rilthian's voice grew colder. "Because they used it." A hush fell over the War Council. The Krex warlord growled. "And what exactly does this engine do?" The old Rilthian looked up, his ancient face filled with something close to fear. "It does not destroy fleets. It does not conquer empires." He hesitated. "It erases reality itself. The battle begins." The coordinates to the Annihilation engine were deep inside a system so old that even Nova's archives had no record of it. The War Council made its choice. Humanity and its allies would retrieve the engine, or die trying. As the largest fleet in history assembled, Kane stood on the bridge of the TNS Revenant, his gaze hard as steel. Nova's sensors flared. "Admiral, they're here." And then, the darkness came. The stars disappeared as something massive entered real space. The hive consciousness had found them. And it was endless. The void itself twisted, shifting in unnatural ways. Reality bent, as if something was trying to break through. The final war had begun. The fight against the impossible. The first wave of the entity descended like a storm. Not ships, not fleets, but nightmares given form. Creatures crawled from the darkness, twisting and breaking physics itself as they descended upon the fleet. The battle was chaos. Humanity's warships fired everything they had. Plasma cannons, railguns, EMP bursts. Entire dreadnoughts exploded as the creatures ripped through hulls like paper. The Veilshire, once enemies, now fought alongside humans, their biomechanical fleets burning against the tide. But it wasn't enough. Kane's face was grim as he gave the final order. "All ships, protect the TNS Deliverance at all costs." The TNS Deliverance, the ship carrying the strike team to the Annihilation engine. If it failed, the galaxy would end. The Annihilation engine awakens. Reynolds and his team landed on the Forgotten World. The Annihilation engine stood before them, a monolith the size of a moon, buried deep within the planet's core. It was not made of metal. It was made of something else, something not from this universe. Nova's voice crackled in their comms. "Hurry, the fleet is falling apart." Reynolds and his team rushed to the control chamber, but then, the hive consciousness spoke. "Do not activate it." Reynolds froze. The voice was not threatening. It was pleading. "You do not understand. If you use it, you will erase more than us. You will erase everything." Reynolds' hands trembled. "What do you mean?" The hive's voice was desperate. "You think we are the destroyers, but we are the last survivors of the First War. We were made to contain what lies beyond. If you fire that weapon, it will not end us. It will end reality itself." Reynolds' heart pounded. And then, he saw it. Through the rift, beyond the hive's creatures, something else was waiting. Something far worse. Something that had waited for eons to be released. The hive had been trying to stop it. And now, humanity was about to doom itself. The choice that decides everything. The battle rage. The last of the Terran fleet held the line, their ships burning, their people dying. Kane's voice echoed over the comms. "Reynolds, fire the damn weapon." Reynolds stood before the activation console. His hands hovered over the controls. One button. One choice. The galaxy hung in the balance. And then, he made his decision. Everything turned white. Epilogue. The aftermath. Light. Then, nothing. When Kane opened his eyes, he was on his ship. The battle was over. But the hive was gone. The entity was gone. And so were hundreds of star systems. Erased. Forever. Nova's voice was quiet. "Admiral, we won." Kane closed his eyes. But at what cost?